Hi everybody, I'm Ray Barron Woolford. I'm the CEO of the Kath Duncan Equality and Civil Rights Network, and I'm so awesomely delighted to be a guest of Xavier Rox on Us People podcast.
Hey guys, and welcome to another episode of the Us People podcast. I'm your host, Xavier Rox, and today I'm humbled to have Ray, who is the CEO at Kath Duncan Equality and Civil Rights Network. Ray, thank you so much for coming on the Us People podcast.
Thanks for having me, guys. It's just such an amazing podcast, and I'm just such a huge fan. I just love your podcast. That's not just, the thank you for having me bit, but it's just generally. I mean, I think your podcast is really, really awesome, and I love listening to it.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Ray. I'm humbled to actually hear that. My first question, you've had such a long life in the sense of what you've been through and how you've managed to become the person that you have become. And there are so many questions that I want to ask you. But my first one for you today is, how was growing up for you? I know me and Ray actually spoke like a good hour. It's been almost an hour. Me and Ray have been talking before we actually even started the podcast. And it's beautiful. That's a beautiful thing because we actually have more of a connection now. I don't know if Ray would agree with me, but we have more of a connection now knowing that we have spoken to each other. But one of the first questions that really do want to ask you, Ray, is I know about your childhood when you were younger, but I want the listeners to understand a bit more about your childhood and how was growing up for you.
God, and my really, I had a really, really difficult childhood. My mother was raped, and I was born as a victim, really, of that scenario. And my mother was sent away as a child to have me in another area. And my grandmother pretended to be pregnant so that we didn't bring any disgrace on the family. So even though my mother was raped, it was seen as a disgrace that a woman could be pregnant. And so I was raised until I was 12 by my grandmother and had lots of conflict. My parents, who I thought were my parents, were my grandparents, and they couldn't cope with all the emotional turmoil of my mother and what had led to my existence, meant that I was consistently put into the childcare system. And so I was constantly being abused, both physically and mentally, for many, many years. And then at the age of 13, I'd had a row with my grandparents, and I was sitting at the top of my stairs in my house, and I overheard my grandmother, who I thought was my mother, having a conversation on the phone about a divorce. And so I went downstairs after the conversation and said, "You even lie to me about having a divorce. Why are you having a divorce?" And I was 13, and then they said, "Well, we're not having a divorce." And it all came out that they didn't tell me my mother had been raped, but they just told me that my mother had me, and they had adopted me and rescued me, and all this trauma that had actually gone through it. And at the same time, I was sort of having issues coming to terms with who I was. So I was like, not just was I lacking love, but I was also lacking identity. So I didn't really know who I was, and I was confused, and I was starting to realize I was possibly gay, but looking on television, I didn't fit the criteria of what was gay. I wasn't John Inman or Danny LaRue, and I didn't find men like that attractive. So what was wrong with me? And because nobody loved me, nobody really cared, I was thrown out of state school because I was violent as a child. I had needed special needs. And the state sent me to what's called Rudolf Steiner, which is a specialist type of school, which deal in all, homeopathic remedies, alternative lifestyle. It was more focused on creating the individual than academic. And I was there, but I was mixing with a very broad range of people, which was really great, but I was boarding. And when I wasn't boarding, I was being abused at home or in childcare or wherever. And so when I got to 16, I ran away from home and came to London, and lived, in all sorts of different, a famous squat in Brixton for a while, trying to come to terms with who I was as a gay man. And then as I sort of got older, we came across sort of AIDS in the 1970s and 80s. And I was working bizarrely in a restaurant with another waiter, and this is how I came homeless and how really sort of things kicked off. I was working with a gay guy, but in those days, people were terrified to tell anybody you were gay. You pretended we were all in the closet. And I worked in a very famous restaurant called Langhams Brasserie. And I found a hotel I was sharing a room with one of the waiters who I liked. And then we got a flat together in Shepherd's Bush. And one day, I thought he was working the shift and I was in bed with another man. And my flatmate came home and found me in bed with another man. And I was so traumatized at being outed in that way that I said to my flatmate, "Hey, I'm going to get a pint of milk." And I never went back. And I ended up living on the streets for nearly a year as a homeless gay man. And because I was too traumatized, the thought that somebody new had discovered me, not just being gay, but physically engaged with activity with somebody of the same sex, was so traumatic for me. And then, of course, AIDS came along, and I'd managed to get a flat in Kennington, in southeast London. And I decided that with so many of my friends were being affected by AIDS, that my small flat, was just a studio flat, kept being filled up with people who were coming to me because they were being thrown out of their homes by their family, quite often by their own lovers, because people were so terrified that you could catch AIDS from the toilet seat. And so I decided I would do something about it. So I set up a housing estate agency to house gay people and people who'd been infected with AIDS through blood transfusion. So that's predominantly people of color at the time. And so I set up this social housing project, and I was housing people, and that really sort of got me into the housing. So it got me out of my council flat. But of course, all this work gave me high profile. So one day I was sitting on a bus from Vauxhall going to Brixton, and I overheard two guys talking about a by-election in Angel Ward, which is now Cold Harbour in Brixton on Lambeth. And I heard about this by-election. They were saying, don't worry about it because nobody is going to win. It's a Labour seat, always has been, always will. And I was so incensed that people were taking things for granted in that way that I went to Brixton and had a look around this particular poor ward, a sort of a council estate area. And I knocked on a few doors and realised this is the place I wanted to represent. And so I got the nomination for the Liberal Democrats in those days, who were quite a decent party in those days. And I was selected as the candidate for the seat that was unwinnable. And I worked day and night. And in my first week, I came across a West Indian couple who were living in a tower block. And the flat the council didn't do any repairs. And they'd had a water tank linking the tower block, which had caused stalagmites coming through the roof. And they were sleeping on a kitchen table in the kitchen. So every night they'd get a step ladder, put it on the table and sleep on a mattress. So they said, you politicians are all the same. And I said, I'm not a politician. I'm a community activist that cares about what hasn't been happening all these years. And so I got the BBC round the next morning. And within 48 hours, this is before I was elected, I got that family rehoused. It was on BBC Radio 4. The BBC was so astonished about how people were living at that time that story, even today, people in Brixton still call me Moses because I got them out of the water. They got rehoused, and I was elected to council and became a councillor for Angel Ward against all the odds. They even sent out busloads of MPs from Westminster the week before, when it suddenly realised that people were saying they're going to vote for Ray Woolford. And then what happened was, it was the time when we had butter mountains and beef mountains in Europe. And so I wrote to the EU Commissioner and said, with all this, why leave it in the warehouse? I've got hungry people in Brixton that need food. And just before the Brixton riots, so I was sort of there at that sort of Brixton, just to the bubbling over of that. And then what happened was that the minister, the EU Commissioner, I didn't think would reply to my letter, wrote back and said, how many people do you represent that are in financial crisis? And I said, there's about 17,600 people in the ward. So they said, right. So 2 weeks later, another letter arrived. We're sending you 17 tons of food. Please organise storage. And so I ended up the only politician in Britain to have got the butter and beef mountains from Europe to come to Brixton. And the profile that caused outrage. It led to a House of Commons debate where the politicians, my opposition, the Labour Party at the time, was saying, why Ray Woolford, we need an investigation. He's using common market food to bribe the voters of Brixton for election power. I was elected at the time. It was just, I did it because I did it. And two things happened. One was the farming fisheries did a big investigation, which is unheard of a local councillor, who found that Ray Woolford was an exceptional councillor who had gone beyond the call of duty to do what he did for the people he was serving. But that also put me on the radar for Combat 18, who were a far-right organisation in Britain back in that day. And I was targeted, and they started to break into my flat. They put petrol bombs through my flat. They broke in and with excrement wrote Nazi stuff all over my walls and queers should be dead. And then one day I had to move out of the flat. It became too dangerous for me. I was being rehoused by Lambeth Council to a safer flat. I was walking, this is all going on during the middle of my re-election campaign. I was walking up Kennington Park Road at 12:20 in the afternoon, and a car drove up by the side of me, and two gunmen jumped out and said to you, "Are you Ray Woolford?" And I'm saying this language just for accuracy. And I said, "Yes, I am Ray Woolford." And they said, "Well, you're a dead queer fucker." And then they started shooting me, and it was so surreal because it was 12:20 in the afternoon that people standing around thought they were filming the old Bill or the Professionals or something, and were standing to watch and looking for the camera crew. And fortunately, I had an alarm on me. I managed to press the alarm, and the police were not very far. Kennington Police Station wasn't too far, and so the police came and rescued me, and they drove off. But as I heard the siren turn, I was shot in the chin. So I'm the only British, one of the first British politicians, the only LGBT politician to actually be attempted to be assassinated in Britain. And fortunately they failed, but we caught the guy. The guy was actually caught. We got into the police van. We drove around till we found them hiding, and they were arrested. And because at that time, homophobia wasn't a crime, instead of being charged with attempted murder, they were only charged with assault and got 18 months.
That was it?
That was it. For attempted murder, they got 18 months. I mean, to be fortunate, I was lucky they got caught. But that also meant that I couldn't run for office because all this thing had gone on. I hadn't been able to knock doors. I was in a secret address. It was unsafe for me. And so I lost my seat on Brixton Council, which I loved and did a lot of great work for. And that was really the defining moment, which really turned me into a political activist, leading my council estate on the anti-poll tax movement in Trafalgar Square, getting involved with the housing and the LGBT civil rights movement. And that's really what shaped me and gave me the money through the housing estate agency, gave me the money to fund the groups. And that also gave me the opportunity to give people jobs, house people that were homeless, because I went from when AIDS went, I moved from AIDS to people, that were homeless. So I started housing homeless people who just wanted a break. Not everybody. I would help them with the benefits and things like that and get them sorted out. And that's what I did. And so I was, and even when I was selling houses, I wouldn't sell houses to buy to let landlords. I'd sell them to local families. There's people that live in Brixton, live in Deptford now, because I made sure that those homes went to people that wanted Deptford as their home, not as a place to make money. And so I'm sort of quite proud of that. It's caused me a lot of grief. A lot of people say, "Oh, Ray's a wicked estate agent." I was an estate agent, but I was a social entrepreneur. I did a lot of amazing stuff. I housed people that nobody ever wanted to house. I was Pink Paper, Businessman of the Year. I'm the only one in the property business in Britain to have been won the award for London Chamber of Commerce for my work on innovation and housing and stuff like that. So I proved that you don't need an education. You can come from a really bad background, but as long as you're true to yourself and as long as you try to live a decent life, you can have a good life. And I've had struggles. I've had partners that have died. I've had friends that have died. I had that homeless period where I was living on the streets and I was homeless. But all the time, it was always the people that had nothing that always there for me. And that's
That's true.
with me now.
How was it like being homeless? what's the experience? What's your experience of being homeless for anybody else who just wants to understand what homelessness is about? Because I don't believe that we speak about it enough. Yes, we speak about it to a certain degree, but we don't speak about it enough.
I think you learn to be a survivor. I mean, people think, why are people in doorways? To a certain extent, the reason why people choose doorways is because it's relatively safe.
Yes,
When you're in an alleyway or when you're in under a tree or on a park bench, people are more likely to urinate on you, to abuse you, to rob you, or to try and sexually abuse you. The one thing that always shocked me was, as a man on the street, was how often people would offer you money for sex. I mean, that was one of the things that I found most shocking. You hadn't washed for a week. You were desperate for a sandwich or whatever, or even a glass of water, and people would trade you a bed for the night for sex, or a shower for sex, and that still goes on, and I still find that aspect of it quite shocking. The other thing is the abuse that you get. It's quite shocking. I mean, I do understand that in London, and I have this problem myself, there is so many layers of homelessness in London. You have some people who are homeless and it's a way of life, it's a comradeship, it's what you haven't got a responsibility. It's not a matter of giving somebody a flat. When you're on the street, you know where you can get a free can of lager, or you can get a cup of coffee, or you can get sandwich or something to eat, or comradeship. If you put somebody in a flat, there's no support network. That's worse than
yeah,
being homeless for some people. The other issue, of course, is that food. I learned to. I got a black pair of trousers and a white shirt, and I'd pretend to be a waiter, and so I'd sneak into hotels and I would eat with the staff, and that's
that's
how I
smart.
got food. And there was a place in Leicester Square called the Swiss Centre, and it had 5 different restaurants. And so I'd have a different menu every day by going around the different restaurants, and that's how I got through it. And then I'd sleep during the day and walk at night, because at night was when you got the most abuse and the most violence. And I found that I would sleep in the parks during the day where I'd be relatively safe, and then I'd
Yeah,
walk at night, and that was got me around. And there was a comradeship. I had friends that died of drugs. My best girlfriend that I had on the street, woke up with her one day and she was dead. She'd done a heroin overdose, and that was really traumatic for me. And that probably was one of those things that really got me in more focused on the housing issues. About campaigning as a housing activist against homelessness. And now, of course, in London, and you go around the world and you go around the UK, there's so many homeless people. How do you define? People say you should chat to them and say hello, but if you start saying hello to one, how do you stop when there's literally hundreds of people on the how do you define which homeless person you work? And unfortunately, there's aspects to it which are uncomfortable. There is people who are professional beggars who have a home
yes,
to beg, and people don't define. There is a difference. A homeless person would never beg you for money. Yeah, there's an illusion. A homeless person has their pride, they have their respect, they have their dignity. They're not beggars. and
yeah,
and people don't see that, and you have to make your own judgment. And there's a lot of organizations say you should give to homeless charities, but of course most homeless charities, some of the biggest homeless charities in Britain, have never housed a single person. The biggest housing charity in Britain, who everybody thinks houses people, has never housed a soul. In fact, I personally have housed more homeless people than most of the corporate housing charities in Britain, because the way the housing sector works, they all have jobs, they're all writing policy, or all got a career, they're all working the third sector. In the same way we're moving into food banks, that's becoming a career footpath. Instead of eradicating these problems, we are creating employment opportunities. And all the time you create jobs, all the time you create cash revenue streams, there is no incentive to eradicate the cause, which is why I campaign so hard that we need a Minister for Poverty, which is my Parliament petition at the moment, to eradicate the causes, so that we tackle the injustice of not having social housing. Social housing is ridiculous. If councils have social housing, they have rents which they can pay for services. If you sell off social housing, where's the council going to get the money to pay for the childcare provision, the care for the elderly, the youth clubs, the libraries? Most of that comes from rent. If you sell off social housing, what do you do with that? How can it be just with right to buy, that we as taxpayers give people 70% of the value of their houses so that they can buy a social house, that they can buy their council house and then sell it off. And then, as we hear now, that 60% of all social housing that's been sold is now owned by private landlords who buy to let. Now, why at that time, when you buy a new flat today, you'll quite often have a flat, a lease that would say no dogs, no cats, no students, no wood floors. When they had right to buy, why didn't they put a clause in that that said these houses can only be sold and only rented back to the local authority for social need and can only be sold to people on low incomes? That would keep the prices and that would keep the diversity in housing, because I lived on a council estate for 38 years. I now have my own home. I've done well with my life, but that doesn't mean to say I've been driven by greed, but I've been able to turn my life around and been successful with my life.
But that's a choice. You made a choice, Ray, to turn your life around.
Yeah, and so when a lot of my friends were dead, but with the housing thing, it was like I don't get why people don't understand that with the right to buy, that when you build social housing and have the diversity, a lot of people with the right to buy say right to buy was terrible. That's not actually totally true. Right to buy, the positive aspect of right to buy, it meant that all sorts of people had ways of making money. So I set up my social housing project because I was able to buy my council house and then sell it. And that gave me the money to fund my enterprise, which housed homeless people.
Yes.
So that's what I did. I, as somebody in my background, couldn't borrow money. A kid from childcare. How the hell would I get any money? I got it through my council housing. So council housing right to buy was good in terms of giving poor people access to money. That where it went wrong was, and also the diversity of the states. We don't really want to have a situation where everybody living in our council estate is on welfare and on drugs. You have to have a diverse community. And the one thing that Right to Buy did was it meant that you had doctors and nurses and mechanics and priests and care workers and bus drivers and people on benefit and single mums on your council estate. So you had an inclusive community, which is a great way of living. Where it went wrong was that the money was never used to spend on building more social housing. And that's where it went wrong. Had they used that money to build social housing and kept it to use fund frontline services and to build more diverse, cohesive communities, then that would be welcome. And of course, everything ends up about money at the end of the day.
Yes.
And that's where it went wrong.
That's very true. What are the failures of civil rights movements or networks that you feel should be improved?
I think the problem with I got involved with, one of the things going back to housing leading into this was one day it was a Monday morning and we had a staff meeting at my office in Surrey Quays in 2014. And I found a group of men in suits going through the council estate bins opposite my office. And I went out and I said, what the hell are you doing on a Monday morning in suits going through the bins? And they said, well, we've got jobs. We just started, but we need the money we have to pay for the bus fare to get there. And we can't get any benefit because at that time when the new welfare reform started, you couldn't get emergency loans. You had to wait 5 weeks until you get your first gyro. It was not how it was. And so they were doing it to eat. So I thought, this isn't right. So I got together with an extraordinary black Windrush activist in Deptford called Barbara Raymond, who was in the 70s then, who I'd met years ago, who had been going around the streets giving out bread and food to the homeless, quite often her own pension as well. And I said, Barbara, we've got to do something about this. So we opened the first food bank in Lewisham. There wasn't any at that time. And we did it in a non-discriminatory way. So we opened a food bank. We said, no vouchers. If you're so hungry that you need to ask for food, then we will feed you.
Yes.
Because we found that vouchers is discriminatory and not everybody is comfortable with it. And so we set up, and with the first week we had 38 people. Within 6 months we had 4,600 clients. We were feeding 11% of the local population. And because we didn't take vouchers, people were walking from Croydon, from Newham, from Finchley, because we were the only food bank in the UK that didn't take vouchers and didn't discriminate. And then out of that, it was quite strong. We got a lot of abuse for it, downgrading property values in the area. But we then set up, we didn't have a law centre. So I then set up, because when you start dealing with food, you then suddenly realize the reason people are poor is because there's other issues. And a lot of the people, we couldn't feed the homeless at that time because there was homeless charities in the area. And they said, if you start giving people food, we will lose our funding. So therefore, we only did the working poor. But that's still, a lot of families. And from that, it sort of snowballed that we started doing legal advice. And so I trained myself through books to be a lawyer. And I was helping people in court because people couldn't, there was no law centres in Lewisham, there still isn't any. And people couldn't get legal aid. It was weeks to get citizens advice help. So I was helping people stop getting evicted, getting people around the bedroom tax rule, stopping people being deported that have been here for generations. And I was going to court. And in those days, it was relatively easy. The court would give you a set time to go to the court. So I'd go to the court and I could do 4 or 5 cases a day. And then they did away with that system. They said that everybody has to go to court and you could be there for the whole day. And so that meant instead of helping 4 or 5 people a day, I could only help 1 person a day. And then, of course, it became too complex. And then our rent went from £7,500 a year to 32,500 plus 18,000 business rates. And we couldn't get charity status because to be a charity, you have to have a cash income. And if you're a food bank, you're dealing food. People give you tins of beans. They don't give you £5 notes. And so we couldn't get charity registration, so we couldn't get the business rate exemption. So we had to close and run it like we've been doing up until recently in people's front rooms and backstreet kitchens. And we run it now school holidays, to tackling poverty in the school holidays, and Christmas to make sure all of the people in our community have a decent Christmas. And so we sort of snowed it. And then, of course, with COVID, we then set up the COVID Community Support Network. And that was about feeding people, giving support, and dealing with mental health. So one of the unique things we spoke earlier was we felt, how do we tackle with people's mental health?
Yeah.
And we decided to give people plants. And so people said, why don't you give everybody fruit and veg? And I said, well, because if you've got mental health and you give them a spider, give them a tomato plant and it dies, that can undermine your well-being. But if you give them a spider plant, it's very hardy. Even if you forget to water it, it will still grow. You can chat to it, it'll grow babies. And it's really good for your well-being. And we were finding that the people in isolated flats or living alone found talking to the plant was actually something that gave them company, and watching it grow didn't just give them hope, it improved their well-being. And so bizarrely, everything I've ever done, it's the odd things that have impacted on it in that way, which has changed things. And then the civil rights thing came around because when I was writing, when I was running the food bank, we needed more and more money because we were getting more and more people coming through the door. We all worked for free, although we paid our volunteers an allowance, because I think it's really important you don't exploit people. Even if you're volunteering, they should at least get meals and their bus fares and things like that. And so we were the only food bank that were actually paying our volunteers, because we were telling people who were giving stuff, we were doing it because we were open and honest. I think it's really important. There's not enough open and honest transparency in the charity sector. And we're very much about solidarity, not charity. And so from that, I set up a Deptford Heritage Festival to raise awareness, community engagement, to undermine gentrification, because I felt if people take pride in where they live, they're more going to be engaged in the community aspect. And we did that, and through that, I discovered this woman called Kath Duncan, who was a Scot and a civil rights activist in the 1930s, who bizarrely had lived in my street. And that led me to write a bit about it in a book called Deptford. I wrote a history of Deptford again to fund my work. And that led to me spending a 5-year journey researching and writing a play, Liberty, about the civil rights and LGBT history in Britain, which we don't really know about. We're taught about Stonewall, we're taught about Nelson Mandela, we're taught about Martin Luther King, we're taught about Gandhi, but the British civil rights movement is never taught because it was led by a queer woman who was working class, who was poor, who happened to be a communist when it's never been cool, who took on King, she took on the Parliament, she took on everything and the legal system, and she won. And because she won, that's why we know nothing about her, even though she was the first woman that led to the establishment of the National Council of Civil Liberties. The Kath Duncan civil rights case was the first civil rights case fought in the British courts. It led to the first civil rights case in the House of Commons debate. And yet, by rights, she should be a household name, and we know nothing about her. And so that sort of got me involved sort of with the civil rights. And then what really turned things around was one day at the food bank, I heard a radio phone-in with Julia Hartley Brewer on LBC, and she was saying, why is it that poor people are always fat? And she said, if they're so hungry, why is that? And if they're so poor, why is that? So I rung her up on the radio show and said, Julie, you've got it all wrong. You know, a loaf of bread full of rubbish is 47p, but a healthy Swede from your Waitrose is £2.74. If you have a family and low income, what will you feed your family? And I said, you've also got to take into account with universal credit, it's not about budgeting. These people have to wait 5 weeks until they get an income. This is people with zero income. So she came to the food bank and she was so traumatized by it that she did an hour and a half live broadcast from my food bank with working poor. And she was so mortified by it that, and I was so touched by the power of writing that I then went on and wrote Food Bank Britain, which became a global, success. 2014, I got a message from President Obama, who got it for Christmas, thanking me for my work, which was, showed me the power of writing. And then what was extraordinary with it was that it got one day out of the blue, this couple of years later, I got a call from Marbella, from a radio station in Marbella called Talk Radio in Europe. And they were telling me that my book, Food Bank Britain, was a big hit with refugees and people coming from Bulgaria. I was out selling Harry Potter. And the reason being is that people knew when they got to Europe, and to Britain, they could get jobs, they'd have to wait to get money, but they would need to eat. And so people were using my guide, Food Bank Britain, as how they would eat when they got to Britain. And it got such an engaged conversation the way we're having today, although it's all about me. You're a really interesting person. What happened was that they gave me a radio show in Talk Radio. So I was like doing a Skype once a month on the big issues that I cared about passionately around the world. And I wanted to have a radio show that talked with people who knew the issues, who weren't the usual suspects. When we watch British TV, it's always the same broadcasters, it's always the same commentators, always the same experts. It's never the people that live on the ground that really understand the issues. And so I'd invite people on who were not the usual people. And one of those people was a guy called Hisham Al-Amishi, who was a Yemen civil rights activist who spoke brilliant English, who wasn't politically aligned, who was funny, a father of 2 young boys. And I'd interview him on the show, and he'd tell me about Yemen, about living through the war and the trauma and the politics of it in a way that engaged and got people to understand without switching off. And that led to him being picked up by CNN in America, The Guardian in London, and he became very famous to such a level that he was seen as a threat to the Houthis. And the Houthis in Yemen kidnapped him. And one night, bundled him out the back of a car, kept him in a hole in the ground, beat him up. And I thought, what can I do? I felt sort of responsible. So I set up this hashtag called Free Hisham. And that got picked up in America. The American Senate started demanding his release. It got picked up by the House of Commons. The SNP raised his plight in the House of Commons. The UN started demanding his release. And so we'd have one day a week where we had an hour for Hisham globally, where people around the world would tweet and support and demanding his release. And then somebody out of the blue, and I'd also at the same time been involved with the Free Nazanin movement, which is, in Iran. And which is a bit more complex because being a gay man, I'm dealing with, fundamentalist Muslims who have their own issues with being gay, So for me as an activist in the Middle East, it's a bit more tricky and a bit more odd. But out of the blue, somebody said to me, and I think this anybody listening, this shows you the power of what we all have as individuals. So why don't you text or contact the leader of the Houthis? Everybody's got Twitter this day in the age of Trump. So I tweeted al-Houthi, the leader, and I sent him a really nice message saying I was a friend of Hisham Amishi. He was a really great guy. He had empowered me to fall in love with Yemen and the people, and that he wasn't your enemy. He was a friend and only wanted peace and love. And nothing happened. And then about a week later, he directly contacted me from Yemen and said, I like what you say. We have a connection. And we started communicating, and he started telling me stuff about Saudi Arabia, which I knew, and I had my own debate in about Saudi Arabia and the war issues with Yemen and arms trade, etc. And so I wrote an article about something they wanted me to write about involving Saudi Arabia. And so I wrote the article, and in exchange for writing the article, we got the release of Hisham al-Amishi. And Hisham was released, which is quite extraordinary because I was a gay man. The United Nations failed, the United States government failed, the British government failed, and Hisham had been a student at Winchester University, so there was a British connection. And I, as a gay man, managed to get him out of Yemen. And today, Hisham al-Amishi works for the United Nations, and it's likely to be the next president of Yemen once the democracy is in place and the war is over. And all of that came about through my activism at the food bank. So, when you think what you do in your own home or in your own community doesn't really matter. I've just demonstrated how my book ended up in America, gave hope and help to refugees and Bulgarians, got a man out of jail in Yemen when most people were being killed, tortured, or completely vanished in Yemen, still are to this day. And then, with my work with Kath Duncan, what I realized was that there was a need because of the grassroots organizations I met. I found that whether it was lesbians or Rwanda and Ugandan that sought me out around the world because of my Hisham work, people started to contact me to tell me their stories of struggle and civil rights. Could I help them? They didn't have any money. They weren't part of a corporation. They weren't a big organization. It could be one little girl in a village somewhere like Greta Thunberg, how she started, single girl outside a parliament building once a week. There's lots of Gretas out there around the world. And so the Kath Duncan Equality and Civil Rights Movement is really a platform to get money and resources to all these groups, to help and advise them, to give them support and solidarity, to raise profiles so that if they get jailed, we know where they are and who they are, to raise their profile, to get them out. It's not always successful. We're still working with Nazaeen. We're trying to get Nazaeen out of Iran. It's not always successful. But even the power of you on your own sofa, whether you're a disabled person, whether you're a mum with 5 kids, we can all find 2 seconds to tweet something on civil rights. And so my organization is about empowering people who care passionately about social justice and inequality, and showing you that even by signing, people say, oh, don't sign a petition, they're a waste of time. But my Parliament petition for a Minister for Poverty, you sign that, and it's the only petition you'll ever sign where the government has a legal obligation to respond. And so even though we don't get the minister, the government knows that people are out there are holding them to account. Why aren't you doing something about poverty? Because today we're all told about COVID and the cost to the economy of COVID. And yet globally, more people would die today, tomorrow, and died yesterday of poverty than will ever die of COVID. And you do wonder why. The reason we allow poverty to kill so many people is because people in poverty are predominantly people of color, whereas COVID is predominantly people of white and important to the economic structure of the economy. So it's about money, and it's just that disparity. When I wrote Food Bank Britain, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation said the cost of poverty in Britain is 78 billion a year, 78 billion on the impact of poor health, poor education, poor health, housing, crime. It makes sense. A few years ago, Tesco's, I can't remember the exact date, but I did an article on it about 4 years ago. Tesco's was earning £4.5 billion a year profit. And yet staff that worked for it were claiming 1.5 billion in welfare payments. So that 1.5 was really a taxpayer subsidy to Tesco's profits. And so like Right to Buy, stopping us subsidizing people's huge discounts, we should be building social housing, not giving people discounts, but actually building social housing. We need certain nurses and doctors and teachers and road sweepers and whatever else, care workers, can live where they choose to live. I understand with, rising populations, that's not always the case, but it must be that when you build housing, that you do reflect what's needed in the wider community. And I build into also about disability. It's shocking how much housing is built with no thought to the rising numbers of people that have disability. If you're in a wheelchair, there's no point sticking you in a 17-story tower block.
Exactly.
Or children. So there's lots of issues around that, and I don't think that. I'm hoping with the Minister for Poverty and things like that, that we can do more. And I do accept that a lot of your listeners at the moment feel there's so many issues, there's so many campaigns out there that how do they choose one? And I've been involved with Black Lives Matters before it was Black Lives Matters became a hashtag.
Yeah.
And every black activist has been doing the same. With Lee Jasper and all the others that have been going over the years, and Jackie Walker and many others. I think that the issue is that you find the cause that you have an understanding and a passion with, and you do what you can to help. And everybody else, if there's somebody that says, can you tweet and support, then you raise awareness and do your bit. And the reality is, people say, about voting or whatever. You look at who's standing in your community and who's best likely to represent your view, and you support that person. They may not win, but you've done the right thing. And I think we all in the world we live, we just have to do what's right. We have to stop trying to be Lady Gaga. We've got to stop trying to be Stormzy. Remember that Stormzy, Lady Gaga, and Madonna are famous because they are who they are. And we're
Yeah.
all awesome individuals. And I think when I wrote my play, Liberty, about Kath Duncan and the start of the civil rights movement, and when I wrote her biography, The Last Queen of Scotland, what it highlighted to me was that ordinary people, we all start off ordinary. But what makes us extraordinary is not our bank balance, it's what we do with our lives and the impact. And Maria Angelou had a very famous quote: "People will never remember what you say, but they'll always remember how you made them feel." And
Yeah.
I think that's really important. I love my road sweeper. My street I live in is always beautifully clean because the guy cleans it with such passion and dedication. Why should he be less value than somebody that manages my local bank? He
Yeah.
impacts on my life. The people that care for my elderly disabled neighbours, who keep them alive and give them quality of life, they're the people I value, not the people that are in Westminster that are getting pay rises every year and allowances and say they represent these people, and actually the reality in COVID have not been seen. Because one of the big things we've seen about COVID, which we've seen about Grenville, which we've seen about the Black Lives movement, is that, and in Belarus more recently, is that what is happening around the world is it's people saying we've had enough, and it's people, whether it's one person like Greta so many years ago on her own outside a Parliament building, we're all as people doing it for ourselves because the political system has failed us, the union system has failed us, the elite has failed us, left and right. And the only one we can really trust to help each other, which COVID has highlighted so profoundly, is that people we can trust to help us most is the people that live next door to us. It's the people, it could even, not just the road sweeper and the bus driver and the nurse and the care worker, but it's just that humble person that smiles, when we pass their window every morning. And the COVID thing has been really empowering because it's there's been a lot of superficial nonsense with it, which drives me mad. Why people have raised billions for the NHS, but we couldn't get a penny from the state or the council to run our COVID support network. We had to do a GoFundMe page to buy the food. Small grassroots organisations like ours don't get no state funding because we're political. We speak and say the way it is. And if you conform, they give you lots of money. And if you're critical about the way things are, then you get nothing. And fortunately, I'm in a position where I can fund my work through my books. When people buy my books or go to my website and buy our T-shirts, that funds their work. So that's how we keep going. But the reality is not many grassroots organizations have that power. And Kath Duncan Equality Civil Rights Network helps all those grassroots organizations have the power to compete with Oxfam and Shelter and all the other organizations, because equally they're all important. And I would argue grassroots organizations today save more lives than many corporations.
See, tell me about some of the people who you admire who are in civil rights. Some of the people that the whole point, I know you've been through so much, but tell me about the people who inspire you to do your work every day that you do.
Oh God, that's such a good question. What frustrates me is many of it's always women. I mean, when I had problems with growing up without a mother or dad, a lot of people say, "Oh, it's great." When I was growing up, everybody say, "Oh, it's terrible, all these single mums." I was a bastard. That's what people would call me. But the problem for me was I didn't have a mum or a dad to love, and I think one of the hardest things my whole life was never having a mother. And not having a mother really was traumatic. My whole life, all of my work has always been about women. It's always been supporting, writing about, working with, empowering women. And I had struggles with my mental health at one point, and my doctor said, "This is all about your mother. It's your mother abandoned you twice into the care
Yes,
system, and because your mother abandoned you, you're trying to prove to your mother that you were worthy. You were worthy of being
that's
loved."
true.
And people don't understand how the importance of love. And anybody that comes from poverty will tell you it's not the toys, it's not the money, it's not the holiday in Spain. It's the love of your mother or your father that matters to you more than anything. There's nothing else that matters to you more than the love of those around you. And I never had that as a child. And so that's really, my work was all about. And then suddenly I did my play, Liberty. We staged it in London as part of the Deptford Festival and the LGBT History Month. And out of the blue, my mother sent me a Facebook friend request on Facebook. Can I be a friend after 57 years?
Whoa.
And it was traumatic because we'd never had the conversation about why she abandoned me, about the rape. We'd never had that talk. She'd just run away from it, and I'd run away from it as well. And then, of course, because of my sexuality, I was, it's like I didn't want to explain who I was and how I was. And my brother contacted me out of the blue. I have two half brothers, and one of my brothers, and I had no goat with my brothers. They weren't involved with all the trauma that happened in my life. They were innocent victims of it all. And so I met one of my brothers, and it was Christmas, and I took my husband with me to their house for Christmas. And we met all these people, and it was like my brother, his wife, who was gorgeous, their children, and their children's children. And it really hurt. All my life, I'd waited for my mother to walk through the door and I would have forgiven her. At that moment, I realized it was too late because I'd missed my brother's children. I'd missed my growing up, playing with my nephews and nieces. I'd missed their children. All these people were my family, but they were total strangers. And it was really uncomfortable, though they made me feel very welcome. It's like, how do you in that environment have to keep explaining who you are and why you haven't been there for 50 years? And so it's really difficult for me. So I did have the meeting with my mother. My mother came to my house and I said, "Look, we're going to have it for an hour." And she came to my house, and it was only an hour, but I could only deal with it for 48 minutes. That was enough. I couldn't cope. And after 48 minutes, I asked her to leave. And and then she came to my stage play. And after my stage play was quite extraordinary because I'm dyslexic, so technically I can't write. But I'd written the play because the civil rights movement was important to me, and I thought, LGBT, my struggle with LGBT histories as an activist had been an issue, and so they'd all come together, and also this woman, Kath Duncan, and so I'd written the play, and the opening night, a guy called John Moss came, and he was 99 years of age, as white
Whoa.
as a button, but he'd marched with Kath Duncan in the 1930s. And so when he saw my play, it reminded him of his teenage years. It all came flashing back to him. And I said, "John, how was my play? How accurate was it?" And I think as an activist, sometimes when you're a writer, you write about things. When you're an activist, you can get to the spirit and the emotional of something because you know how they think. It's very different when you're writing a biography about somebody. You can do it from a perspective of the notes. But because of an activist, and I've been through those struggles, I can understand the mindset. And so therefore you translate that mindset into your writing. And because there's been so much written about Kath Duncan because she was spied on, she was the best friend of Clementine Churchill, who became later the wife of Sir Winston Churchill. So she had lots of connections and there was lots of paperwork to uncover. And so when he came and I said to him, "What did you think?" He said, "Ray," and he was crying. And he said, "I was back with my comrades." And as a writer, to know that it was that accurate. And the next morning, my mother had sent me an email. She'd come to that staging, and it was a success, the play. And my mother sent me a text, man. She said, "Ray, I'm so proud of you." And those three words, "I'm so proud of you," those few words completely solved my mental health. I had a nervous tic. I had all sorts of mental health issues. The acceptance from my mother that I was a decent human being. I know I'm a decent human being, but having that after all these years from my mother to say that she was proud of me was like, it seems so superficial to so many people, but a lifetime waiting for that to happen was life-changing really for me. And that really told me I could relax and be who I was, be true to myself, and that it doesn't matter what other people think, it's what you think yourself. And
Do you
right.
think that you've forgiven your mother, Ray, for everything that she's done? Because forgiveness is a hard thing to do. But do you think in your heart that you've actually forgiven her for who she is and what has happened, and forgiven yourself for what has happened and how you feel?
It's a really good question. I think part of the problem with that is that forgiveness is something that, technically we all taught we should forgive. Okay, you have to forgive. Because if you don't forgive, it haunts you, and it eats away at who you are and your mental well-being. So you have to forgive in a certain way. I don't call her mum. She always signs off the email as mum. And I think to be my mum, that's earned. And I don't think she's earned the right to be my mother. I call her Jean, that's her name. She's never been there at any stage in my life, through my abuse, through my trauma, through my loss of my partner, through my struggles. She's never been there. She's only been there with my success. And I still wonder, if I was living on the streets today as an alcoholic or with drug issues, would my mother have propped up in the same way? Has my success motivated that? So that always haunts me. And the other issue I think on forgiveness is that um, you don't really have the right to forgive. I think you have to. The life I've had has been extraordinary. Would I've wanted it any different? Um, I would have had a pretty boring. Looking at my brothers, I would have had a very boring life had I not had the life that I've had. So the homelessness, the impact I've had, my sexuality, my struggles with my mental health, my meeting the people I have, the extraordinary life I've had, the things I've achieved, is way beyond I ever imagined I would achieve as a small boy in the care system. And my work now, and I get invited onto shows like yours, which is a great honor, to talk about my work. And I do it in the hope that there's other people like me out there that feel isolated or alone or feel useless, who actually can, can build some more self-worth
Yeah.
and more confidence, and realize that, even though the system seems screwed against you, there's always a way, a path that you can find.
That's
And
true.
it's not always obvious. And sometimes, what you do may seem strange, and and all the stories we've talked about today have always been extraordinary, but have all come out of the unexpected.
That's
And,
true.
and I think that's how life is. We all want to be doctors, or we all want to be teachers, or whatever. Or we always have this clear picture of what we want. But the one thing we all have, whether black, white, Jew, Muslim, or atheist, we all want to be happy.
Yeah,
And I think
I agree.
that's the key. Trying to work out what makes you happy, whether it's you and you don't have to be married. You don't have to have a partner. Get a dog or a cat. It's like life is or a plant. It's like don't let society dictate how you want to choose your life. Make you be the decision. Make you be the inspiration. Make you be the one that decides the pathway that you want to take. And if you don't want to take it today, that's fine. There's tomorrow or the day after.
Yeah, I
There's
agree
no
with it.
rush. And what's going to be is going to be. And never think you're too old. I'm 63 now, and I have a busier life now than I ever did when I was a teenager. I go to the gym. I have a better shaped body than I had when I was, a teenager. And for the first time in my life, I still, witness homophobia. I still find it shocking. I mean, I tell you, a truly shocking experience that happened to me just a year and a half ago in Pizza Express in Greenwich. Me and my partner went to Pizza Express on a Friday night, and we were having a pizza, and the manageress of the store was a black woman. Okay. And there was a well-to-do white woman with a daughter and a baby at a neighboring table. And they were being very loud on a Friday night. And so the manageress came up and asked them if they could be a bit quieter. And this woman used the N word to tell her to F off.
Yeah.
And me and my partner were traumatized by it because I hadn't heard that word in a very long time, thankfully. And two, I was in a place where that language was being used, which was very uncomfortable for me. So I immediately got up, and my partner got up as well, and went over to the table and said, "That's totally outrageous what you've just said to that woman. Can you apologize?" And the manager said, "Look, I'm used to this sort of abuse." And we said,
You shouldn't have to.
you should never, ever find that acceptable. So the woman started thinking, then she started calling us queer and all sorts of abuse. She told my partner to go back to his synagogue, so it became anti-Semitic as well, because she presumed because of his look he was either a Muslim or a Jew. So that all came out as well. And we were having this dispute, and the restaurant was packed with people. And the woman said, "Well, if you don't like us and you don't like our company, pay our bill to leave." Yeah. And this is a year and a half ago in Greenwich. And so the manageress, who'd had all this abuse, just allowed them to walk out free without paying. Nobody called the police, which I'm furious about now, thinking on it, because the day before I'd been walking to my gym and a carload of people had gone by, and a load of people called me queer out of a van as I was walking to the gym. And I thought I'd missed, no, puff. They used the word puff. And I hadn't heard
I
that
haven't heard that word in such a long time.
in a long time. So I turned around to think whether I hid it, and they repeated it. And so I'd had these two instances within 24 hours of each other. And so, and the cafe, and then at the end of the meal, when the people had left, everybody in the restaurant came up and thanked us for standing up to these two people. And we said, well, but not one in that restaurant went up and put their arm around that woman to say sorry for the abuse that she had just been victim to.
Yeah.
And that's the sort of thing. So I think we still have these issues. It's not just about the violence that young black men experience from police, but it's also about the wider cultural issues that we still have. That when you go into a supermarket with a friend of color, the camera or the security will always follow them, not you. And also the fact that when you're in the company of that language, you have a moral and social responsibility to say, not be quiet, but to speak out that is not acceptable and challenge it. And whenever I come across this, I always challenge with fact. It's not enough just to say, oh, this is rubbish. It's really important that you give reasons why you have that viewpoint. So if people say, we don't want refugees here, I always remind them of Lesvos, the Morea camp that we work in with my Kath Duncan Quality Network. There's in that camp, there's surgeons, there's doctors, there's midwives, there's chemists, there's engineers. Many of the refugees that flee to Europe are the most educated. They're the ones with the money. They're the skills we need. And so when you are actually saying we don't want refugees, you're turning away doctors, midwives, engineers, the people that could create the new economies, the people that could be employing your kids. And so I think that's really important to remember about refugees. Although the other issue, of course, a wider issue that people need to focus on as well, is it's not, I don't think morally it's right to recruit nurses from the Philippines and from Africa and places like that, because we are taking nurses and doctors away from countries that need them. We should be forgetting about building factories for Coca-Cola and building up a health structure, an education system. So instead of people fleeing these countries, we actually build up a structure of where we want to go there, because Africa's a beautiful country. South America's a beautiful country. If we build them and help them have green economies, then people don't choose to flee. And we're going to have a greater crisis because of climate change. There's still war and uncertainty and poverty. And until we tackle those issues globally and forget, we have to, as individuals, sort of see how we can interact with the climate, with animal welfare, with each other more broadly. And the one thing that Black Lives Matter has made, and the climate change Extinction Rebellion has shown, that when you can build a movement, the politics will follow and the change will happen. And we've got a vice president of America, a woman of color, and history is extraordinary. And there is issues. There is issues with the people on the left have issues with her. You've got to understand that all of us who are public figures, all of us who are activists, at one point or another, we have to compromise to get something. I had to compromise by negotiating with the Houthis. I had to work with the devil, but I got Hisham out. And you have to understand that as a lot of political activists don't understand. They think, you've got to live in this bubble. You can only stick to your principles. You've got to stick to your principles and your belief, but sometimes you have to work with the devil to win the wider picture. And I think that's really important for people to follow through on. And so even though she gets a lot of nonsense, there's lots of issues about her record as a prosecutor and her issues with people of color. You've got to remember she was just one cog in that system. And getting 2 or 3, it will change. It will change. It takes time. It still traumatizes me that people that are black trans people in America, one is shot every week in America. It still shocks me that 40 million people in America get food stamps because they're too poor to buy food. It shocks me in America that there's 28 million people living on the street. It shocks me that America is seen as the democracy of the world that we all aspire to. When you look at the ground and how the poorest live, that is not a model that any of us should be copying.
It's funny, Ray, because a lot of people won't believe you until they actually go out and see it themselves. Because I went to America for 3 months. I lived there for 3 months just to explore and just see a different life. And it shocked me to see, even when you're in the train station, how many people are homeless in the train stations, let alone outside.
It's so true. I think the problem is it's all about our whole education system is all about inspiration. It's why when I do a talk about food banks, nobody comes. Get 10 people in a dog. When I talk about food waste and the food cycle and the food shortages and the food climate, I will get hundreds of people. And poverty is, I'm very much alone in when I campaign against it. People run a mile when I'm talking about poverty. Even on Twitter, I lose 200 or 300 people once I start talking about poverty. It's because the society we live is all about inspiration. We all have to be successful. We all have to have a house. We all have to have that home in the sun. We all have to be sending our kids to university. We all have to have. We have to have. We have to have. And all the time you have to have, you're so busy trying to get the have that you've forgotten to live the life. And in America, we led all the examples we see, and even when you watch, The Wire and all these TV shows, which I love from America, they all live in extraordinary grand houses. The kitchens are bigger than most people, whole family living in the UK. And so your perception of America, even in shantytown, is so distorted from the reality. And of course, it doesn't fit the narrative. How can we be inspirational when, poor people are, in the richest countries in the world, are living in such dire situations? And I think it's how we change that. I don't think it's going to change in my life. It frightens me that in Poland, in Hungary, the rise of the far right in France, in Egypt, in the UK, in America, there's no guarantee Trump's not going to lose in November. It's you look around the world and it's like the 1930s relived. We've still got poverty. Instead of soup kitchens, they're food banks. The crisis around the world. You wonder what struggle have we achieved. And the other thing, which is an issue I think that I'm working on after COVID, is we talk about black slavery doesn't exist. Can I tell you, everybody, now that black slavery is still very much exists? There is black men working in Spain at the moment on farms in Almeria that work for nothing. What little money they pay for living in shanty huts. Quite often they work until they die. They have no health care. They have no protection in law. They're exploited. They are modern day slaves. And the food that they produce is then sold in our supermarkets in the UK. And nobody says anything about it because it's within Europe. If these were in Africa, we'd be talking about it. But because it's within Europe, black slavery is something of the 1800s. The reality for black women in the sex trade, children, and men of color Slavery is very much a reality for far too many people, even in 2020. And it's a conversation we should be having, but of course nobody will because of the colour of the skin.
So bad. That is so bad. That's I can't stand hearing things like that because obviously me being a gay woman of color as well, I understand totally where all this is coming from, and we should talk about it more. But what I think it is as well, Ray, is that people are afraid of awkward conversation. I'm not afraid of awkward conversation. I love awkward conversation because it teaches you to be more open-minded and less ignorant about what's around you.
But don't you think one of the things that I think about homeless is when I see homeless people, because there's a clear alternative for housing. There's at any one time there's 150,000 homes in Britain which are empty. We go through any high street anywhere in Britain, even in Kensington, Chelsea. There's empty buildings which could be temporary housing. What I worry about, and this is a very serious question, is with so many housing, so many communities now where homelessness is wherever we walk, wherever we go, we pass homeless people. Is it not part of the elite's narrative that by having so many homeless people, we get past them by and we go, but for the grace of God do I? And so it's almost a warning that if we don't conform to the system or support the system, these people we step over every day to get our coffee at Costa could be us tomorrow. And
It's
I
true.
do wonder whether that it's a deliberate part of the narrative, the whole food bank agenda, the homeless agenda, that there's no real plan to eradicate the problem. I mean, we heard about during the crisis they were going to build all these flats to house all these homeless people, so there'd be nobody on the streets. You go to any town, I've been to Hastings recently, I've been to Canterbury, there's lots of homeless on the street. You go around London, it's the same. Uh, I really think it's whether there's a wider agenda, whether it's the subconscious that we're all being warned that be good boys, be good girls, and do what you're meant to do, and you'll be okay. But if you're not, you could so easily be at the food bank or homeless. Although to be fair, I don't think there should be any shame about using a food bank. If you're in crisis and you need a food bank, then you use it. There should never, ever be any shame about admitting that you're in poverty and you need help, or that you need the use of a food bank. When I wrote my book, one of the shocking things when I started Food Bank Britain, what I uncovered and I'm so proud that every food bank around the world operates differently. When I started my food bank, I was shocked to discover that most of the food banks were run by churches. And so when they gave you food, they would make you pray to God and give thanks to God for the food. And then the other thing which I found was really shocking was they wouldn't feed your dog or your cat because the perception was if you're on benefits, you shouldn't have pets. And so I challenged that and I wrote articles and I wrote in my book about this. And I said, look, if people are in poverty, they should be able to get help. If you're a church or a place of faith, you should be helping people out the goodness of their heart, not as a tool to convert people to your faith. Because if you do good, people will want to come to your church because of who and what you do, not because you're bribing them with food. And so now through my food bank, and I also highlighted the fact that people have been made redundant. They may have had that dog or cat for 10, 15 years. Why should they throw it out because they're sacked? And so, and the other issues with it were they were giving people a bag of food or a box of food and telling people to be grateful. And I said, well, that's totally wrong as well, because what happens if they're vegan? What happens if they're vegetarian? What happens if they're a Muslim? Why are you giving everybody hot dogs, pork hot dogs to Jews and Muslims? And the view before my book was, well, they're hungry, they should be grateful for what they get. And then they forgot to take into account that lots of people, did you know 100,000 people in Britain are so poor they cannot afford to pay the monthly standing charge for gas and electricity and are not connected to the main grid, so they can't cook. So what's the point of giving somebody a chicken if they can't cook it? So my whole ethos of the food bank was interviewing people, finding out what they ate and what they could eat because of dietary requirement, and also what they were able to cook, or if they couldn't cook, dealing with that problem. So every food bank in Britain now asks their clients Do they have cooking facilities, and what are they? Do they have pets, and they help them with their pets and their diet, toiletry requirements? And doesn't just give them food, it asks them what they would like, so that you don't end up with food waste, and you end up a more cohesive policy. So again, that started from my food bank in Deptford. I'm really proud of that, because that changed that whole psyche. So again, through writing, you can do extraordinary things. And the fact that every food bank in Britain uses my model, I'm extremely proud of, because not because it's for me, but it was morally and comprehensively wrong the way they were operating, and it had to be changed. It had to be challenged, and I'm proud I've done that. And it makes you enemies. I mean, when you speak out, fortunately, I'm not going to have a bullet in my head. I don't expect that these days, but you will get people who will smear you, who will write stuff that, people are very funny on social media. Somebody will write something that's totally untrue, put it on some obscure blog that you've never heard of, and then publish it as fact. And even it could be complete nonsense, like that you're the daughter of Hitler or something, and you're a man, and people will believe it because they've seen it on social media. And I get this sometimes, and it's like, and then I always challenge it and say this is nonsense, but in more polite words maybe, and and but you do get it. So whenever I get profile, there's always people that try and shut me down, and I realise that whenever I get to the point where I'm most likely to bring about change, then
Yeah.
I do it. And one of the extraordinary things, and a lot of people know this, but before David Cameron was leader of the Conservative Party, I knew John Major, who was Tory Prime Minister. John Major was the son of a circus performer and came from Brixton. And because I represented Brixton, that's how we became friends. And so John Major, who was a decent man, I've got a lot of respect for him. You've got to remember that people have different political viewpoints. That doesn't necessarily make them bad people. And he asked me to work with the Conservative Party. So for a brief period of my history, I was involved with the Conservatives, which a lot of people don't know. But why I say that is because my role in the Conservatives was working on equalities. And through my work, I was able to get the first people of colour to be selected in winnable seats as parliamentary candidates. So I'm quite proud of that, because if you want to change a policy agenda, or you need to change a party, you sometimes need to have to do it within. And so you can change things with equality by having black people within the Conservatives. Is not a bad thing, because it brings awareness to people that need to be challenged. So even though Conservative, like black people get a lot of abuse for being in the police, the reality, them being there is issues, but it should be seen as a positive thing. In the same way as, if they're in the Conservatives, we should always hold them to account. But if they can help change views, as I did on people of colour being candidates. And then the other thing I worked on was getting gay marriage. The Labour Party didn't support gay marriage. They opposed it. In fact, gays in the military was opposed. Tony Blair's government went to the court to try and stop it being made legal. It was the European Parliament that made gay a legal right within the forces. So even left and right parties sometimes get it wrong. And so with the Conservatives, I was able to get people of colour selected as candidates, and I worked on the policy which allowed the right of gay men to have civil partnerships, and gay women, of course. And so sometimes, people say, oh, the Tories are terrible. They may be terrible, but there's sometimes you can find an issue where you can find common ground and you can win it. And I tell you, the right for gay people to get married and the protection it gives people is extraordinary. It's one of the most precious things we have. And so I'll always be grateful for them for that one thing. There may be other things I'm not happy about, but for the giving gay people the right to marry the one they love is very precious and very valuable. And you have to give thanks where it's due, and that's one of those rare opportunities where they do deserve respect. And I'm proud to have been part of that, even though I get a lot of nonsense about it because, oh, he was once Tory. It was a long time ago. People change, but you've got to remember that you have to work with different people with different views. If you always only speak with people that share your viewpoint, you will always have a distorted view of the world, and
That is
you'll
true.
always be disappointed.
That is very true. What's the best advice you've ever received, Ray, from someone?
Oh God, that was good. That's a really difficult question. The best advice I've ever had
Mhm.
is never, ever, ever see people for the way they want you to see them. Always see people the way they are, not how they want you to see them.
I like that.
Because we all, even, all of us, even here, we have this persona that we present. Whether you're
Yeah.
presenting your radio show, there's a persona. That's not you. You're being a professional. You're in a certain mindset. The real you is still lovely, as a radio presenter, but I can see who you are through your face.
Yeah.
And that's the power. You can see bad people in the face, or you can see people that had a hard life through their face.
That's true.
Sometimes the image that people give you is what they want to give you. And quite often, the better human being is behind the shadow.
That is true. I agree with you totally there. If there was one thing that you could change within yourself, what would you change?
God. Do you know, I think this is a strange thing to say, but the one thing I hate has really been the biggest struggle I've had in life being a gay man. The one thing I've always missed is not being have children. I've always wanted, when I was in the childcare system, I
Yeah.
always wanted to have. I always pledged, all those kids and the horrible time we had in childcare. I always thought I'd love to be a parent and get kids out of there and give them a decent life. I'd love to be a father. And then of course, you see so many children. I think one of the things we have in life is we're so obsessed with having our own children. And you forget that when you meet your partner, the person you love and want to have children with, you don't have shared blood. So
Yeah.
why not adopt or foster children?
Yeah.
Because the love you have for that child would be no different to the love you have of the person you're with. And it still breaks my heart when I see so many young teenage kids on the TV, looking for fostering, looking for adoption, and people don't because there's a blood issue. And nobody seems to think, well, the person that you live with, you don't share blood. So the one thing you share is love. And
That is true.
if you want children, foster, adopt. If you don't have a lot of money, foster children because the state will give you a bit of money to help you out. And that's the way. But I just feel, I think probably if I could be any different, would probably be a straight man living an easy life with a wife and 2 kids in suburbia, because it's been a struggle. It's like, life like mine. I've had an extraordinary life. I'm extremely proud of what I've achieved. But my God, it's been difficult and it's been traumatic and it's been hard. And even when like last October, I was working in a refugee camp. We were smuggling books into the refugee camps in Greece because they didn't want schools to be established, because that would mean that the camp was not transient. So a lot of these refugee camps are transient. So the concept is that people are only there for a few days. The reality is they're there for 5-6 years. If you've got children in Moria camp in Lesvos, there's 500 children in that camp, the one camp, whose parents have drowned on the way to Lesvos. So they're orphaned by the time they get to the camp. So they've got no identity. They've got nobody wants to know about them. So we go in and give them books and teach them. And it's just heartbreaking that we, children that, unloved and unwanted, miss out on so much. And there's so many parents out there that want kids and
Yeah, that's
can't
true.
get it, that it's the love that's important, not the bloodline. And and it's difficult. And if you're working with, and anybody that listening, that works in the care system, that works with elderly people, that works with special needs, works with, it is unbelievably rewarding. I wish I was brave enough to work in that sector. I think it's incredibly brave and inspirational, the people that work in the care sector. I think they're the ones that inspire me, and probably working with them or animal rescue would be where I'd like to be. But the part of it is I hate anything that involves cruelty. So, even a wildlife program, I won't watch it because I'm terrified a lion will eat a deer. So that will upset me. So I won't watch it. And so it's like, you have these sort of things, and the one thing annoys me even with the LGBT thing at the moment is that we're all people, and there's all this, the worst type of politics at the moment is the trans agenda. That whole trans thing is so toxic and horrible. And I know people have mixed views, and they're both lovely people, and it's really horrible that we can't get that sorted, and why it's so aggressive and violent and negative, that whole debate around trans, and how it can't be resolved. And then the other issue about this competitiveness that, when we started out in LGB in the 70s and 80s, we were one community, and we all worked together, and there was solidarity, and we worked together with the bikers and the drag queens and the divas and the lesbians, and they all lived in Hackney in those days. It was all like we all had these sort of, we were this tribe, and now we've become less tribal, and we've become more corporate. And I think that's the one thing I think sad about our liberation, is that it's become more, we've forgotten our heroes. You speak to anybody in Britain, nobody knows about their LGBT history. Nobody could name any LGBT activists other than Alan Turing or something like. You name a famous lesbian in history, you won't find anybody that knows. Why is that? And then LGBT history needs to be more taught within our, it's not about slave history, but it's also about LGBT history and about who we are as individuals. And working class history, we need to know more about working class history, and take the politics out of it and do it from the social perspective, and then people will get more out of it.
Well, that's true. I agree with you. Definitely agree with you there. What advice would you give to anybody looking to be or go into a similar career like yours? What advice would you give them?
It's like you're not going to be rich. It's not going to, but it's going to give you a wonderful life. I mean, the thing is, you've got to think about what you want to do. So if you want to work with animals, one of the greatest things you could do is volunteer in Europe. Across Europe, there's some amazing charities that rescue bears, that rescue donkeys, and even in Egypt, there's a wonderful charity called Spanner, which works with working donkeys, keeping them safe and protected. There's lots of charities, animal, dog, cat rescues, horse rescues in Europe that need volunteers. Go and get practical experience working in these sectors. And then when you've actually got that experience, you'll find what area you want to work in. And that will open doors, because people know people who know people. So in my sector, I get offered lots of work because I work in the sector. Once you're known, it's a small network. It may be global, but there's always things going on. So you find whether it's working with women, whether it's in Africa doing HIV work, or whether it's working LGB, or whether it's working on education, medicine, water aid. Find something that drives you, that you're into. It might even be music.
Yeah.
Taking your music or your radio station and helping a community in Rwanda or the Congo, or Malawi or whatever. There's taking what you love and thinking, how can you upsize it to do what you love to help others? And it's not necessarily something. And these days you can do GoFundMe. You can set up a GoFundMe and say, this is what I want to do a little video of who you are and what you're wanting to do. And somebody will give you the money to start you off. And then it's up to you to keep reporting back what you're doing, the impact of what you're doing, the difference. Show the people you're working with. And then suddenly you will have that niche that makes you happy, that gives you the quality of life you want, and helps you to be the human being that you want. And then others, the whole world will come and circle around you, and you will be the special one that all your family and all your friends admire and look up to, because you've created the perfect life. And it's open to us all. It's not, in the world of social media, we don't need money. Yes, you need money for smartphone. I give you that right. But you can find a little job. You can sell a few bits on eBay. You can scan a few books on Sifit. And if you walk around, one of the things I do to fund my work, I wander around the streets. Quite often I find a table or I find a lamp, and I'll upsize it and I'll sell it on Spock or eBay. And then that helps my work. And it's true, the streets of London are paved in gold. Never be too humble. Never be ashamed. Don't be frightened of being mad. I'd be wandering around, I've got like furniture on the back of my bike, or I'm pushing a Sainsbury's shopping trolley with a bookcase I've just found. Never be embarrassed, because you know what you're doing is important work and it's good at the end.
That's true. I like that answer. That's a good answer. I like that. No, it's true. No one really says stuff like that to me. So here's one for you that might be difficult, okay?
Yeah.
So if you could choose one song that was the soundtrack of your life, what song would you choose and why would you choose that song?
I would choose I Will Survive by Gloria Gaynor because
Ah,
every gay boy loves that song. It's an anthem. I met her once when I was in running nightclubs and things like that, and it opened up a lot of doors with me. That song. I managed groups, and that's probably for another podcast. But it opened up another lifestyle through Gloria Gaynor. I think Gloria is an uplifting song. It's sung by a black woman that knows where she's going and knows where she's come from, and it's all about power and it's a joy. And so it fills you with love, it fills you with life, it fills you with music, and it fills you with the rhythm to dance that beat away.
that's true. I agree with you there. Finally, my last question for you, Ray, is where can we find you on all your social medias and if someone would like to get in contact with you?
Right, the website for all of our work, where you can get all of our stuff, is the Kath Duncan Equality and Civil Rights Network .co.uk. My Twitter feed is just Ray Woolford, RayWoolford, and just look up Kath Duncan Network. My books are Food Bank Britain. It's on Amazon. And also funds my work. My play Liberty is going to be staged 2022 as part of LGBT History Month in London. So look out for that. It's also a book and a play, and I've written songs for that. And also my biography of Kath Duncan, which everybody should read because it's about all the extraordinary women that were part of the movement in the 1930s and 40s, and that's called The Last Queen of Scotland. And it also includes an extraordinary woman called Fiona Brown, who we don't know about, who's the only lesbian to die in the Spanish Civil War, and the only woman. And to fight in the Spanish Civil War, you were not allowed to be a woman, and she passed herself off as a man. And on the battlefield, she was carrying a comrade. She got shot and killed. And it was only when she'd rescued her comrade off the field and she died, they removed her clothes for burial and they discovered she was a woman. So Fiona Brown, another woman who should be a household name.
It's true. Ray, I want to thank you so much for coming on the Yes People podcast. You've been an exceptional guest. So thank you so much for coming and I hope you enjoyed it.
I loved every minute, but it's also a matter of the quality of the host. And when you've got somebody as great as you, it helps you, gives you the confidence to open out and to be who you are. And I just tell you, I do a lot of this stuff and you are just awesome.
Oh, thank you so much, Ray. That means a lot to me. Guys, thank you so much for listening to the Yes People podcast. And please remember you can subscribe to Spotify, iTunes, Google Play, and any other platform that you prefer listening to. Please also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You can also donate to the Yes People podcast simply by going on the Savvy Rocks website or just typing in paypal.me/Us People podcast. Thank you for listening. Stay happy, stay positive. And as always, please continue to be kind to one another.
I only discovered you through the LinkedIn thing, and I've only listened to 2 of your podcasts. So I'd like to listen to more of them. They're really good. Brilliant. Take care.